On April 5, 1933, in a quiet hall in The Hague, 15 judges sat above 2 Scandinavian delegations that looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Outside, Europe was still limping through the Great Depression. Inside, the air felt colder than Greenland. Everyone expected a battle over flags and pride. That's the fairy tale version. The truth is uglier. Norway didn't lose because Denmark outmuscled them. Norway lost because Denmark showed up with the stronger ledger, the cleaner balance sheet, and the one document that turned Norway's claim into bankruptcy. Source: we think this was about sovereignty. It wasn't. It was about insolvency, political, legal, and economic. Norway didn't lose the war. Norway ran out of credit. Greenland wasn't conquered by cannon. It was foreclosed in court. For a moment, rewind to a different scene. A howling Arctic coast where the world looks unfinished. A narrow strip of rock and snow, squeezed between stormwater and the inland ice. A place so empty it feels like a mistake on a map. A small Norwegian crew trappers, hunters, radio men plants itself there like a splinter in Danish skin. Cabins go up. Names go onto fjords. A wireless station hums. The message is simple. We were here, we worked here, we deserve the deed. And in Norway, people want to believe that simple math wins. Land plus labor equals ownership. But international law doesn't run on sweat. It runs on paperwork. It runs on whether your claim can survive an audit. Because Greenland was never just ice. Greenland was inventory, and in the early 20th century, inventory meant resources. It meant hunting profits, future fisheries, control of shipping lanes, and the ability to charge fees, grant licenses, and choke competitors. It meant cash, or at least the promise of it. Denmark, on paper, looked like a small kingdom clinging to a giant island. But Denmark's Greenland position wasn't held by romance. It was held by administration, by monopolies, by regulations, by quiet government routines that don't look heroic, until you realize they are the hooks that hold territory in place. Denmark could point to centuries of "we act like the landlord." State trade monopoly. Rules for who can land. Rules for who can hunt. Rules for who can profit. The kind of dull authority that makes investors feel safe. Source: Norway, meanwhile, had energy. Norway had men on the coast. Norway had nationalist heat, but heat is not a title deed, and the ledger does not reward passion. It rewards continuity. Denmark's strength wasn't majesty. Denmark's strength was bookkeeping. If you want the illusion of majesty, look at Scandinavia's old story. Vikings, sagas, names like Erik the Red, old roots across the North Atlantic. A mythology of origin that feels like ownership. Norwegians could tell themselves Greenland was their ancestral asset, a forgotten property stolen in a bad political divorce. That story tasted like justice, and Denmark had its own majesty. It had the crown, the official seals, the habit of being recognized. When other powers wrote treaties, Denmark kept inserting a quiet clause. Greenland is excluded. Greenland is ours. Greenland sits on our side of the ledger line. Source: it sounds boring. That's the point. Because beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Not in Greenland, in Europe, in markets, in budgets, in national nerves, and by the early 1930s, pride was expensive. Here's the economic trap, the addiction, that made this crisis inevitable. Both Denmark and Norway were small states living on narrow margins, trying to squeeze value from cold water and rough coastlines. They weren't fighting for farmland. They were fighting for cash streams that could survive a hard decade. Hunting and fishing mattered. Weather stations mattered. Radio stations mattered. Control of who could operate on the coast mattered. This wasn't just about men with rifles. It was about who got to issue licenses, collect rents, and lock competitors out. Source now personify the weakness. Picture debt as an Arctic animal that doesn't roar. It just waits. It sits on your chest while you sleep. The antagonist here isn't a general. It's the market for legitimacy. It's the bond between recognition and money. It's the invisible club of states that decide whether your claim is investable. Denmark understood that. Denmark didn't need to win a firefight in the ice. Denmark needed to win the confidence game. So Denmark picked the battlefield where it had liquidity, international law. Norway tried the opposite move. Norway tried a shortcut. A flag, a proclamation, a new name on the map. On July 10, 1931, Norway issued a royal proclamation declaring it had occupied a defined slice of eastern Greenland, between Carlsberg Fjord and Bessel Fjord, spanning latitudes from 7,130 to 7,540 feet north. That is not a vague claim. That is a surveyed invoice. Source. Denmark reacted fast. On July 12, 1931, Denmark filed the case at the Permanent Court of International Justice. 2 days. That's how quickly the Danish system converted outrage into litigation. Not a naval mobilization, a legal wire transfer. Source, let that speed sink in, because speed is what creditors have. Debtors posture, creditors file. Now the descent begins. A chronological spiral where every step looks like politics, but every step smells like economics. Start with the landscape itself. Greenland is huge, about 2,200,000 square kilometers, and 5/6 of it is covered by inland ice. Only a narrow coastal strip is usable. This is the key detail. You cannot occupy it like France. You can only manage it like a portfolio. Source. Denmark's case was built on intent and will. Denmark argued that in polar regions the standard for occupation is lower. You don't need a tax office on every cliff. You need credible administration, consistent claims, and proof you act sovereign. Source. Norway's case leaned on a seductive concept. Terra nullius. Nobody's land. The idea that unused land is unowned land. It sounds like common sense. It also sounds like a prospecting pitch right before the mine collapses, because Denmark had receipts. Denmark could point to state trade monopoly rules going back centuries. Denmark could point to regulatory acts that spoke about Greenland broadly. Denmark could point to exploration and stations along coasts. Denmark could point to a 1921 decree declaring the whole of Greenland linked with Danish stations and administration. Source. Norway could point to cabins and a working wireless at Myggbukta that resumed regular operation from 1926 onward. Norway could point to hunting operations and private company activity. But private activity is not always sovereign activity. It's commerce without a crown. Source. This is where the rule of three hits. The land was brutal. The law was colder. The paperwork was fatal. Norway was walking into a foreclosure with a handshake agreement it didn't remember making. That smoking gun was not a rifle. It was a sentence. In July 1919, Denmark and Norway were discussing a political trade. Denmark was prepared not to oppose Norway's interests elsewhere, and Denmark wanted recognition of sovereignty over all Greenland. On July 22, 1919, Norway's Foreign Minister Niels Claus Elin stated that Norway would not make any difficulties in the settlement of this question. Denmark treated that as an unconditional promise. The world later called it the Elin Declaration. Source: read that again. Would not make any difficulties. It sounds like polite diplomacy. In the court's hands, it became a signed confession. This is how liquidation happens in real life. Nobody screams. Someone just produces the document, the room goes quiet, and suddenly your asset is no longer yours. Even the basic summary is blunt. The Elin Declaration was treated as binding, and it became central to the Eastern Greenland case decided in 1933. Source: Norway tried to argue it was informal, that it was said in conversation, that it wasn't meant as a treaty. But in high diplomacy, the foreign minister is not a bartender. He is the pen. Denmark didn't need to prove Norway was evil. Denmark only had to prove Norway's balance sheet had a hidden liability, and the Elin Declaration was the liability. From there, the case moves like an audit. Denmark frames the dispute as illegal occupation. Norway frames it as Denmark having no sovereignty over Erik Råd's land, and Norway acquiring it instead. The court proceedings ran through late 1932 into early 1933, with hearings from November 21, 1932 to February 7, 1933. Source: think about the scale of that. Months of argument. Mountains of maps. Historians used like forensic accountants. Everyone trying to prove who owned a coastline where almost nobody lived. But the judges weren't grading vibes. They were grading state behavior. They looked at Denmark's steady pattern. Laws, decrees, monopolies, diplomatic notices, expeditions, stations, and the constant exclusion of Greenland in international commercial treaties. That's not romance. That's administrative control. Source: then they looked at Norway's pattern. Late pressure, commercial presence, a flag, a proclamation, and a prior promise contradicting the whole play. In a noir story, this is when the detective finds the ledger entry that doesn't match. The whole case turns on that one line. Now the climax. The default. On April 5, 1933, the Permanent Court of International Justice ruled Denmark's sovereignty stood, and Norway's occupation was unlawful and invalid. The court's reasoning accepted that polar territories have different standards for effective occupation. It also treated the Elin Declaration as binding on Norway. Source: this is where the money runs out, not literal coins, but political capital. Norway had to pull back. The flag comes down. The claim evaporates. The dream of a Norwegian East Greenland turns into an embarrassing line item written off as a loss. Humiliation is expensive. It's the kind of cost that doesn't show up in budgets, but it shapes decades. Because sovereignty is solvency. If the world will not recognize your claim, you can't finance it, you can't insure it, you can't build on it, you can't extract value without inviting retaliation. A territory without recognition is a frozen asset with no market. And the aftermath, it wasn't just legal theory. The ruling became a precedent. In remote, thinly populated regions, Very little direct physical occupation may be required if no rival can show a superior claim. The court effectively reshaped the threshold for polar sovereignty. Source. That matters because once the standard drops, the value of paper rises. It's why later Arctic claims could be framed through administration and intention, not towns and highways. It's why the modern map of the far north looks settled, even when the ground is not. Source. In Denmark, this victory meant Greenland stayed unified under Danish administration. It meant Denmark held the keys to future strategic leverage. Here's the dark punchline. Greenland's economic and strategic value only grew in the following decades. Weather data, shipping, fisheries, and later military logistics made the island far more important than the trappers could have imagined. So that 1933 ruling wasn't just a legal win. It was a long-term option contract on the North Atlantic, signed in ink, paid in pride. Now the generational scar. Norway's loss wasn't only territory. It was credibility. A nation that wanted to be seen as a serious Arctic stakeholder had been caught on the record saying it wouldn't object. That kind of contradiction follows you. It teaches your diplomats to speak like accountants, not poets. It hardens the state. It changes how future negotiations are approached. And it leaves a warning for everyone watching. If your foreign minister makes casual promises, you may spend decades paying for them. Source. The court didn't just decide a coastline. It demonstrated a brutal truth. Economic value flows toward legal clarity. Markets prefer clean titles. In the end, Denmark won because Denmark could show continuous sovereign behavior, and because Norway's own statement worked like a mortgage clause they forgot they signed. Source. That's the ledger deciding history. Not soldiers. Not sagas. So here's the lesson. If you want to understand why nations lose, stop staring at flags. Start reading the paperwork. Start asking who can prove ownership in a way the world will ensure. Because empires don't always fall to invasions. They fall to audits. They fall to one fatal sentence. And if you want more stories where the balance sheet decides the battlefield, subscribe to the channel. Stay ahead of the people who still think history is written by generals. Norway's Greenland heist, the lawsuit that broke the balance sheet. On April 5, 1933, the Peace Palace in The Hague looked like a cathedral built for paperwork. 15 judges sat above 2 delegations from Denmark and no rifles, no trenches. Just polished wood, stiff collars, and folders thick as bricks. Source. Most people think Norway failed to occupy Greenland because Denmark was stronger at sea. That's the myth. The economic truth is colder. Norway didn't lose a war. Norway lost a court-backed foreclosure. The ledger beat the flag. The balance sheet beat the rifle. Source. They didn't get pushed out by bullets. They got pushed out by bankruptcy logic. A claim with weak paperwork is insolvency dressed as ambition. And in 1933, the court decided Denmark's books were clean. Norway's were not. Source. Now let me show you how an entire coastline was liquidated like a failed business. Denmark wasn't an empire in the Hollywood sense. It didn't have endless steel or endless cash. But it had the one thing that matters in territorial markets. It had continuity. It had a paper trail. It had the habit of acting like the landlord even when nobody was watching. Source. Norway, by contrast, had romance. Vikings, sagas, and the echo of Erik the Red. The kind of story that makes a nation feel cheated. The kind of story that makes people clap when a flag goes up in a storm, but stories don't settle ownership disputes. Ledgers do. Source: you can think of Greenland as an asset on a national balance sheet, not because it is easy to use, because it is huge, strategic, and full of future options. The island's total area is about 2,200,000 square kilometers, and 5/6 of it is inland ice. That makes it less like a farm and more like a vault. Source: and vaults attract thieves. Not armed thieves. Paper thieves. The kind who don't break doors. They find loopholes. They exploit unused assets and call it opportunity. That was Norway's play. At Norway's peak in the early 20th century, it felt like a young country with fresh lungs. It had broken away from Sweden in 1905. It was building a modern identity. The sea was its highway. Fishing and shipping were its bloodstream. Source: so when Norwegians looked at East Greenland, they didn't see a frozen void. They saw an unguarded warehouse. Denmark's population and administration were concentrated on the west coast. The east looked like a gap in enforcement, and gaps are where money gets made. Source: Norwegian hunters and trappers began operating there. Cabins multiplied. Hunting routes became routine. Radio stations appeared. And by 1929, both hunting operations and a wireless service at Myggbukta were being carried on by a Norwegian company named Arctis Næringsdrift. That's not a picnic. That's a business footprint. Source: but beneath the surface the foundation was rotting. Because private footprint is not sovereign title, commerce can occupy a coastline for years and still be evicted if the state behind it has no lawful deed. Norway was building cabins on land it did not legally own. That's how you end up with a condemned property. Here's the economic trap, the addiction. In the Arctic, resources don't arrive as gold bars. They arrive as rights. Rights to hunt, rights to fish, rights to station crews, rights to run radio and weather reporting, rights to control access. These rights can be converted into money, influence, and long-term strategic advantage. Source: Denmark understood this like an accountant. It protected Greenland through monopoly structures and legal instruments. The Danish state had maintained a Greenland trade monopoly for centuries, reinforced by ordinances and later state administration. Monopoly is a financial weapon. It keeps outsiders from skimming profit. Source: Norway's weakness was that it treated the dispute like a frontier grab. It relied on the logic of terra nullius, the idea of nobody's land. But this logic works only when nobody can show a superior chain of title. Denmark could. Denmark had been stacking paper for generations. Source: now meet the real antagonist. It isn't Denmark's navy. It's the market for recognition. It's the international legal system that decides whether your claim is bankable. You can't exploit a territory safely if your ownership is disputed. Investors, insurers, and allies hate uncertainty. Source: so Denmark did what solvent actors do. Denmark didn't gamble on gunfire. Denmark purchased certainty with law. It moved the fight into a courtroom where Norway's romantic claim would be audited line by line. The descent begins in dates and numbers that sound dry until you realize they are the steps of repossession. On July 10, 1931, Norway issued a royal proclamation declaring it had occupied a defined territory in eastern Greenland. The proclamation described the area as lying between Carlsberg Fjord in the south and Bessel Fjord in the north, extending from latitude 7130 to 7,540 feet north. That is a corporate boundary description. A legal invoice, source. 2 days later, on July 12, 1931, Denmark filed an application at the Permanent Court of International Justice. 2 days. That's not anger. That's procedure. That's Denmark treating Norway's occupation like an unpaid bill and sending it to collections. Source. This is the rule of 3 in motion. The flag went up. The lawsuit was filed. The ledger was opened. Once the ledger opens, emotion becomes irrelevant. Now you need to understand what Denmark brought to the court, not speeches. Evidence of state behavior. The judgment itself describes Greenland's harsh conditions and why ordinary occupation standards don't fit. The coast is often inaccessible for months because of polar currents, ice, storms, and bad weather.